And welcome to Wednesday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com. He is Paul Dottino. I'm Lance Meadow with you for the next 60 minutes. Two ways to interact with us here on the program, 201-939-4513. Also, hashtag Giants Chat. We're going to cover two programs today in terms of the upcoming NFL prospects, Western Kentucky as well as Missouri. So stay tuned for that, and then we'll get to your phone calls. We'll get to your tweets as we near the beginning of the draft festivities, which will be later this month. What was interesting yesterday is related to the NFC East, Paul, as we tackle some of the latest NFL news before we get into the draft, is Philadelphia Eagles made another trade as they acquired Timmy Jernigan, defensive tackle from the Baltimore Ravens. So the reason I bring that up is, we've been talking a lot about Johnathan Hankins, and he's still out there on the market, but we've seen a few trades now involving defensive tackles as teams try to square away their roster before the start of the draft.
Yeah, that's true. However, the thing that still perplexes me, and I guess it has to do with the asking price, is the fact that Hankins hasn't been listed as taking any visits with anybody.
Yeah.
And so you're right. I mean, there's been a little bit of shuffling going on here, but the only whisper that anybody has been able to ascertain off the internet even is that the Dolphins perhaps wanted him as a part-time player. And that is the only thing I have seen anywhere in terms of even a crumb about Johnathan Hankins. And usually these visits make their way out. I mean,
in this day and age, they tend to. Yes.
So I'm going to go under the assumption that there haven't been any. I don't know what else to say. And so, again, while he's still out there and no visits happening, no talks apparently happening, and, it seems to me the Giants are still very much in play.
Well, I always say no news is good news, at least from the Giants' perspective. To me, though, with the draft creeping up, and we talked about how much depth there is at the defensive line position, if something doesn't get done from his perspective before the draft, does that perhaps indicate even better news for the Giants? Because by that time, you would think other teams would fill their voids at the defensive tackle position.
Well, it could. It could. Of course, if the Giants wind up getting a stud defensive tackle in the draft,
they could
maybe
fill a
first
void there.
or second round, maybe they just decide that that would be a less expensive way to go. And maybe that guy is a plug-and-play player. And quite frankly, folks, there are a lot of plug-and-play defensive tackles in this draft. It is a good draft for defensive linemen. So, would it be a little risky to throw an experienced guy in there? Perhaps. I mean, they've got 3/4 of the front four coming back. So maybe it's not as big a risk as it would be otherwise. But it certainly would be an economically friendly thing to do.
From a salary cap perspective. And I think you brought up an interesting point, Paul. If you're going to put a young guy on the defensive line, better they be playing next to Snacks and with JPP and Vernon,
no
as
doubt.
opposed to you're throwing in a young guy who's unproven with a bunch of other unknown commodities.
Yeah, and quite frankly also, even if it's a young defensive end, he can be isolated out on the edge. Well, if you're putting the guy in the middle of that defensive line, there are people on both sides to help him out. So there's a little bit more room to grow, if you will, and go through some of those pains of a rookie season. A guy who may not have everything down like he's got to have it down. Well, you can hide somebody, I guess is what I'm trying to say in a nice way, in the middle, a lot easier than you can in the defensive line if he's on the outside.
Especially when you're surrounded by guys that are going to draw attention themselves.
Really good players.
Exactly, and they're going to draw double teams. It would free you up. Less pressure on the young, unproven commodity. What's also important to note is in this draft, you said there's depth at the defensive line, but I think there's also depth, Paul, for players who can be moved inside and outside, which also makes this draft class unique. So if you bring in a defensive lineman, you could say, well, you know what, we can move this player around because we could play him a defensive tackle as well as defensive
end. It's
end.
funny you say that. I just got done with the defense now on my film work. All of my defensive prospects, unless somebody else kind of comes to the forefront or somebody asks me to do somebody, I'm finished with all my defensive prospect reviews. And it's funny you mention that because you're absolutely right, Lance. There are a number of defensive tackles who could play either one of those spots. There are a number of defensive tackles who look like they could swing outside in 3-4 schemes. There are a bunch of defensive ends who look like they could swing inside in a sub-package and play defensive tackle. It's just a really good crop of defensive linemen, period.
And versatility is always a positive when it comes to evaluating the draft class. For those of you watching on Twitter, we invite you over to Giants.com to watch the remainder of the program. Lance Meadow, Paul Dottino with you here on Giants.com. Big Blue Kickoff Live, Wednesday's edition, as we continue to preview the upcoming NFL draft. We're going to focus on two schools today, one of which is Western Kentucky. And right now we are joined by the radio play-by-play announcer of Western Kentucky, and that is Randy Lee. Randy, Lance, and Paul here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. Appreciate the time. How's everything?
Wonderful. Nice to be with both of you today.
Well, thanks so much for giving us a few minutes here, and there are a few prospects coming out of Western Kentucky. Let's start, obvious, with the big-name commodity, and that is Forrest Lamp, who's had experience, Randy, at both guard and then moved over to tackle, where he's mainly played over the last 3 years of his collegiate career. Most people are projecting him to be a guard at the next level, but before we talk about perhaps whether or not he can fit in at guard, do you think he could transition and stay at left tackle as he moves from Western Kentucky to the NFL?
Well, our former head coach, Jeff Brom, who played in the NFL for a number of years, quarterback, feels he can, but he also felt like he wouldn't get the opportunity to. He felt like due to arm length and height, he would probably be projected as a guard, and that's where he would start his professional career. He's also been working out a little bit at center. We had pro day here last week, and he was going through some center drills as well. So I think most people anticipate that he will be drafted as a guard, and maybe if something happens and a tackle gets injured or something like that on his team and they need someone, they can move him out there on the outside because, at this level, he was dominant there. Did not allow a quarterback sack in either of his last 2 years as a protector on the blind side for two different quarterbacks.
That's the one question I wanted to ask before we actually got to his individual traits. What about the level of comp and the fact that he's going to be making quite a jump to go up against some of the elite pass rushers in the league if he's on the outside? Even if he's playing guard, there's some really good defensive tackles in the NFL who are going to give him one heck of a time.
Yeah, he didn't. We play in Conference USA, so certainly there's a jump up. But I think he won his first-round draft status for what he did against the big schools the bigger schools that we play in the SEC.
Okay.
He dominated Vanderbilt this past year. He dominated Alabama. I believe the stat that Pro Football Focus had out of the 86 snaps or 85 or whatever we ran offensively against Alabama, he won his matchup 83 times. Very similar to the year before. So we play one SEC school or two SEC schools every year. We play a Big Ten school, and he's been dominant in all of those matchups. Now, he has not had to do that at that level every week, but I don't really think anyone, from what I can gather, is concerned about him making a jump from a so-called non-Power 5 league in Conference USA to the NFL. He's that good.
Excellent.
And I believe, Randy, you played LSU in 2015, which was another one of his impressive performances as well. So that just goes to show you the continued theme of how well he stacked up against SEC competition. In terms of his character traits, Randy, how is he in pass protection versus run blocking? Where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, if any, that he needs to work on?
Honestly, I have not heard any of these weaknesses. Dominant run blocker, dominant pass blocker. We play a pro-style offense. When we needed yards, we ran behind him. Never concerned about right-handed throwing quarterbacks. He's always protecting their backside of anyone ever having a hand on Brandon Dowdy from 2 years ago and Mike White from this year. And he's just been a dominant offensive lineman, the greatest the school has ever produced. And really, I don't know that there's any character flaw or any flaws, characterly speaking or professional speaking, other than maybe he has short arms. He can't play tackle. Other than that, I haven't heard anything.
They've listed him at 6'4", 309, if I read the numbers that I got out of the Combine correctly. What do you think he'll play at in the NFL? Because every college player, when they get to the league, they always want them to get stronger. Now, that may not necessarily mean bulking up, But where do you think his body frame is going to be best suited to play up here?
He can put on some weight. I mean, he's massive right now, but he can certainly probably put on a little bit more. Now, one of the things he does really well, his feet are awesome. He is really quick. He gets that. We pulled with him a lot, so he can get out in the corner and pull. We actually, in the bowl game, we had a play run for us for a couple of years and never used it. Finally ran into a bowl play where he threw the pass. He scored a touchdown and about an 18-yarder. So he's just so darn quick and athletic for someone to be an offensive lineman. He's the real deal. Now, how much more can he put on? I was looking at him. I mean, I could see where he put on maybe another 20 if they felt like that was necessary. I don't know how much that would slow him down. Of course, offensive linemen don't run the 40-yard dash, so maybe he does need to put a little bit more weight. But ferocious competitor. In his last 2 years, he was the team leader. Usually don't have offensive linemen in that role. But he was the ultimate leader of this football program the last 2 years.
The common question we get asked all the time about guys who may be coming into the team, people say, okay, well, is he a guard or is he a tackle? That's the first question. The second question is, well, is he left side or right side? Because, in the NFL, even more so than in college, left tackles and right tackles seem to have very unique sets of characteristics, where your right tackle is more of your mauler, your power guy. Your left tackle can be much more of a technique-oriented guy who needs quicker feet. Have you heard much conversation as to which side of the line Lamp would play?
I have not, to be honest with you. I've not heard that conversation. He played right guard for 4 games in his freshman year when Bobby Petrino was the head coach here in his 1 year here. We were having some backside protection issues, so he moved him in his freshman year after the 4th game of the season to left tackle. Fixture ever since. So he's played only on the left side. I guess if I had to grade him, what would he? Is it pass blocking over run blocking? I mean, he's great at both. I would say probably pass blocking would be a hair better than run blocking. So to me, that would mean left side rather than right side.
Talking with Randy Lee, the radio play-by-play voice of Western Kentucky. Randy, earlier you mentioned that Western Kentucky runs a pro-style offense, and that leads me to the next player of note, who is Taywan Taylor, the wide receiver. When you look at his numbers, they have improved every single season since he joined the crew, which is a positive development. But